The Invisible Heart. A story of second chances. What does it feel like when the world stops seeing you? When time after endless time, eyes pass over you as if you were nothing but a shadow. A ghost that doesn't warrant even a moment's pause. For one old German shepherd abandoned in the darkest corner of the shelter, this wasn't a philosophical question. It was his reality. And sometimes, in the deepest places of despair, all it takes is one person to notice what everyone else has forgotten. The Southside Animal Shelter was a cacophony of life, barks echoing off concrete walls, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum floors, excited gasps from families who just found the one. The air hung heavy with a cocktail of antiseptic cleaners, kibble, and that unmistakable animal musk that no amount of industrial cleaning could fully remove. To most visitors, these sensations faded into the background within minutes of entering. To Shadow, they had become the unchanging soundtrack of his forgotten existence. In the last kennel, hidden away where the fluorescent light flickered intermittently, casting more shadows than illumination, lay an old German shepherd. Shadow, though no one called him that anymore. Not even the shelter workers who'd long since stopped using his name with the affection it once carried. His coat, once rich and lustrous, now hung in patchy, dull clumps around his bony frame. The deep amber eyes that had once shone with intelligence and devotion now gazed vacantly at the concrete floor, clouded with age and the quiet acceptance of his fate. Shadow hadn't always been here. Once, he'd known warmth, the kind that came from sleeping at the foot of someone's bed, from gentle hands that scratched behind his ears just right, from a voice that spoke his name with love. But that was before his person had died. Before his person had died. Before the family had dropped him off with averted eyes and mumbled excuses. Before he became just another old dog in a system overflowing with younger, more appealing options. For over a year, Shadow had watched the pattern repeat. Families would stream through the door, children's faces pressed eagerly to the glass of kennels containing bouncing puppies and young dogs. The Labradors with their perpetually wagging tails, the Border Collies showing off their intelligence with tricks, the tiny mixed breeds that fit perfectly into waiting arms. Day after day, Shadow watched them all leave. One by one, empty kennels would be filled, then emptied again. Only his remained constant, a small, cold space that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. At first, he had tried. When footsteps approached, he'd struggle to his feet, ignoring the ache in his aging joints. He'd wag his tail, press his nose to the bars, trying to connect with the people who passed by. But eventually, the pattern became clear. They would glance, sometimes smile sadly, and then move on to something younger, something with more tomorrows than yesterdays. The shelter workers meant well. There was Marcos, who would slip him an extra treat when no one was looking, and Diane, who sometimes sat with him during her lunch breaks, reading aloud from paperback novels, as if he understood every word. They had made social media posts featuring his solemn face. "Senior dog needs forever home," the caption would read, accompanied by hashtags meant to pull at heartstrings. They'd reduced his adoption fee, added a special sign to his kennel, loyal and gentle, just needs a chance. But the world scrolled past his digital presence just as quickly as they walked past his physical one. So Shadow had stopped trying, stopped lifting his head when the shelter doors swung open, stopped wagging his tail when fingers poked through the bars, stopped hoping. He had become exactly what everyone saw, or rather, didn't see, invisible. Until one unremarkable Tuesday changed everything. The day began like any other. The morning cleaning routine. The distant sounds of the more energetic dogs greeting the start of another day with enthusiasm that Shadow could barely remember feeling. He remained curled on his thin blanket, conserving what little energy he had left. Lately, he'd stopped eating regularly. The bowl of kibble sat largely untouched in the corner of his kennel. What was the point? Around midday, the front door of the shelter opened. Shadow didn't look up. The sound had long since lost any meaning for him. He heard the usual barking intensify as the younger dogs tried to capture attention. He heard the cooing sounds of visitors, the happy chatter of people looking for the perfect addition to their families. And then, something different. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not the hurried pace of someone rushing past to the puppies. Not the shuffling gait of the shelter volunteers. These footsteps stopped, right in front of his kennel. For a moment, Shadow didn't react. It wasn't the first time someone had paused briefly before moving on. But seconds stretched into a... And still, the presence remained. Finally, curiosity, a sensation he'd almost forgotten, stirred within him, slowly, with effort that made his joints protest. Shadow lifted his graying muzzle. Through the bars of his kennel, he saw a woman kneeling down, her eyes level with his. Olivia Reeves hadn't planned to adopt that day. At 42, she had come to the shelter on impulse after driving past the adoption event today sign. Her apartment allowed pets, and she'd been considering getting a dog for companionship, but there was no urgency, no specific plan. She merely wanted to look. The shelter volunteer had greeted her warmly, immediately directing her toward the puppies and younger dogs. "We have some wonderful lab mixes that just became available," the woman had said, gesturing to a row of kennels where excited young dogs bounced and barked. But something had pulled Olivia's attention elsewhere. A movement, perhaps, or simply an inexplicable feeling. Her eyes had drifted to the back of the room, to that last kennel where the light didn't quite reach. "What about dog?" she had asked, pointing toward Shadow's dim corner. The volunteer's smile had faltered slightly. "Oh, that's Shadow. He's been with us for quite a while." "How long is quite a while?" Olivia had pressed. The volunteer shifted uncomfortably. "Over a year now. Most people want younger dogs." Without responding, Olivia had walked away from the volunteer, away from the puppies and the noise, directly to Shadow's kennel. And now she knelt there, studying the old German shepherd who had finally lifted his head to look at her. What Olivia saw broke something inside her. It wasn't just the physical neglect, though Shadow's protruding ribs and dull coat told that story clearly enough. It was his eyes. They weren't sad or angry or even afraid. They were empty, as if the Shadow who had once inhabited this body had retreated so far inside himself that only a hollow shell remained. Olivia's throat tightened. She extended her hands slowly, slipping her fingers through the bars of the kennel. She didn't call to him or make kissy noises or try to entice him with baby talk. She simply waited, her palm open, giving him the choice. Shadow stared at the outstretched hand. How many times had he seen this before? Hands that reached in, then pulled away. Fingers that would pat him briefly before their owners moved on to more exciting prospects. He remained still, waiting for the inevitable disappointment. But the hand didn't withdraw. It stayed, patient, undemanding. Something stirred in Shadow's chest. Not hope. He was too far gone for that. But curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just the instinct that had once made him a good companion. The desire to make a connection. With effort that seemed monumental, Shadow shifted his weight. His legs trembled slightly as he rose, muscles weak from disuse and age. Slowly, he approached the bars of his kennel. The scent of the woman reached him. Not the artificial flower smell of many visitors, not the antiseptic odor of the shelter workers. Something else, something that impossibly reminded him of before, of home. Of home. When his nose finally touched Olivia's fingertips, the contact was electric. Not in its intensity, but in its significance. For the first time in so long, Shadow had chosen to connect. The shelter volunteer had approached quietly, standing a respectful distance away. "That's unusual," she said, genuine surprise in her voice. "Shadow doesn't usually react to people anymore." Olivia didn't look away from Shadow's eyes, which now held hers with an intensity that hadn't been there before. "Tell me about him," she said softly. The volunteer, her name tag read Rachel, hesitated before responding. "His owner passed away. The family brought him here, said they couldn't take care of him. They never came back, never called to check on him. He was already older then, and senior dogs." She trailed off. "Senior dogs, what?" Olivia prompted, though she knew the answer. Rachel sighed. "They're hard to place. People want years with their pets, not months. And they want energy and playfulness, not—" She gestured vaguely at Shadow's still form. Olivia's fingers gently stroked the top of Shadow's head through the bars. He didn't pull away. "Does he eat? Exercise?" Rachel's expression grew troubled. "Less and less. He barely touches his food some days." "And walking him?" She shook her head. "He takes a few steps and then just stops, like he's forgotten the point." Something crystallized in Olivia's chest, a decision forming before she'd even realized she was considering. "I'd like to meet him properly," she said. "Outside the kennel." Rachel blinked, clearly surprised. "You want to meet him?" "Shadow." "Yes," Olivia said simply. "Just him." Rachel hesitated. "I should warn you. He doesn't do well outside his kennel. He's given up in a way." "Then we'll take it slowly," Olivia replied, her eyes never leaving Shadow's. "But I want to meet him." Rachel unlocked the kennel door carefully, stepping inside with a leash in hand. Shadow didn't react as she clipped it to his worn collar. He simply stood there, his body tense but unresisting. "Come on, big guy," Rachel coaxed gently, giving a light tug on the leash. Shadow didn't move. His eyes flicked to Olivia, then back to the floor, as if unsure what was expected of him. Olivia stepped closer, crouching down to Shadow's level again. "It's okay," she said softly, not reaching for him, simply being present. "We can take our time." Shadow's ears twitched slightly at her voice. Something about its cadence, its gentleness, reached through the fog that had descended over his awareness. He took one hesitant step forward, then another. His joints were stiff, his movements awkward after so long spent curled in the same position. Rachel's eyebrows shot up. I've never seen him respond like that before." Olivia said nothing, simply watching as Shadow slowly made his way out of the kennel that had been his world for over a year. Each step seemed to require immense effort, not just physical but something deeper, as if he were remembering how to exist outside that small, confined space. They moved to a small meet-and-greet room, a quiet space with a worn couch and a few dog toys scattered across the floor. Shadow stood in the center of the room, seemingly overwhelmed by the openness around him. His tail remained tucked, his posture uncertain. Olivia sat on the floor, ignoring the couch, making herself smaller and less intimidating. She didn't call Shadow to her, didn't try to force interaction. She simply waited, giving him the space to decide. For several long minutes, Shadow didn't move. His amber eyes scanned the room, occasionally returning to Olivia's face, as if trying to understand her purpose, her presence. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, he took a step toward her, then another. When he finally reached her, Shadow did something that made Rachel gasp audibly. He lowered his head and gently rested it against Olivia's knee. The gesture was small, easily missed if you weren't paying attention. But in that moment, it contained everything. Surrender, trust, a fragile tendril of hope, extending from a heart that had forgotten how to hope. Olivia's hand trembled slightly as she stroked Shadow's head. "How do I adopt him?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. Rachel seemed stunned. You want to adopt him? Shadow, are you sure? Senior dogs come with challenges, medical issues, shorter time together. Olivia looked up, her expression resolute. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves a home, no matter how much time they have left. Her fingers continued their gentle rhythm on Shadow's head. He's been invisible for too long. Shadow's ears perked up slightly, as if he understood the significance of the moment. And perhaps in some way only dogs can comprehend, he did. The paperwork took time. Vaccination records, adoption forms, a small fee that had been reduced for a senior dog. Through it all, Shadow remained close to Olivia, not quite touching her but never more than a step away, as if afraid she might disappear if he lost sight of her. When the final form was signed, Rachel handed over a worn leash and a small bag of Shadow's belongings. The thin blanket from his kennel, a chew toy that showed no signs of having been chewed, medication for his aging joints. "You're doing something amazing," Rachel said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Most people don't see past the gray muzzle and the slow walk." Olivia took the leash, her fingers brushing against Shadow's head again, in that gentle, reassuring touch that was already becoming familiar between them. "Then most people are missing out," she replied simply. The walk to Olivia's car was slow, measured by Shadow's cautious steps. Each movement seemed uncertain, as if he had forgotten how the world worked beyond concrete and metal bars. When they reached the vehicle, Olivia opened the back door and waited. Shadow stared at the open space, clearly confused. "It's okay," Olivia encouraged softly. "We're going home." Home. The words seemed to register somewhere in Shadow's consciousness. His ears twitched forward. After a moment's hesitation, he attempted to jump into the back seat, but his weakened legs betrayed him. He faltered, nearly falling. Without a word, Olivia gently supported his hind end, helping him into the car with a care that preserved his dignity. She arranged his blanket beneath him, making sure he was comfortable before closing the door. The drive was quiet. Shadow lay still in the back seat, his breathing the only sound. Occasionally, Olivia would glance in the rearview mirror, checking on him, and each time she found his amber eyes watching her. Not with expectation, not with excitement, but with a quiet attention that seemed to be memorizing her every move. Olivia's home was a small cottage on the outskirts of town. Nothing grand. A modest living room that opened into a kitchen, a bedroom, a small fenced yard with a maple tree that cast dappled shade across the grass. To most, it would seem unremarkable. To Shadow, stepping carefully from the car into this new world, it was overwhelming. He stood frozen in the driveway, his nose working overtime to process the flood of new scents: grass, earth, the remnants of a recent rainfall, the subtle markers of other animals that had passed through the yard. His legs trembled slightly, whether from weakness or uncertainty. It was impossible to tell. Olivia didn't rush him. She stood quietly beside him, the leash loose in her hand, giving him time to adjust. "Welcome home, Shadow," she said softly. "Welcome home, Shadow," she said softly. "Everything here is yours now." Shadow's ears twitched at her voice. Slowly, with the careful deliberation that seemed to characterize all his movements now, he took a step forward, then another. His progress up the short path to the front door was measured in these small victories, each step carrying him further from the life he had resigned himself to. Inside, Shadow paused again at the threshold. The house smelled of cinnamon and old books, of freshly washed laundry and the faint lingering scent of morning coffee. No antiseptic cleaner, no cacophony of barking, just quiet. Safety. Olivia had prepared for him. A plush dog bed waited in the corner of the living room, positioned where the afternoon sun would warm it. A water bowl, already filled, sat nearby. There were toys, not the plastic, primary-colored playthings from the shelter, but soft, dignified things appropriate for an older dog's gentler play. Shadow surveyed it all with quiet attention. He took a few more steps inside, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Olivia slipped the leash from his collar, giving him freedom to explore at his own pace. But Shadow didn't explore. Not immediately. Not immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to Olivia, studying her with an intensity that seemed to ask, "Is this real? Will it last?" Olivia knelt down, bringing herself to his level once more. "It's okay," she said softly. "We have time. All the time you need." Something shifted in Shadow's amber eyes, a flicker, a spark of something that might, with care and patience, grow into trust. And then he did something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. His tail, still tucked close to his body, gave a single, tentative wag. The days that followed established a gentle routine. Mornings began with Shadow rising stiffly from his bed, joints cracking as he stretched. Olivia would prepare his medication, hiding the pills in a small piece of cheese, a trick Shadow pretended not to notice, taking the offering with delicate care that made Olivia smile. Breakfast was a careful negotiation. Shadow's appetite, dormant for so long in the shelter, awakened slowly. Olivia experimented with different foods, kibble moistened with warm broth, bits of boiled chicken, rice mixed with pumpkin to soothe his sensitive stomach. She celebrated each small victory, each additional bite taken. Walks were short at first, limited by Shadow's endurance. 3 houses down the street, then 4, then 5 at try. Progress measured not in miles but in moments. The first time Shadow sniffed a neighbor's mailbox with interest. The day he lifted his leg to mark a tree. The morning he spontaneously picked up a stick, carrying it proudly for half a block before, setting it down again. There were setbacks. The thunderstorm that sent Shadow cowering into the back of the closet, trembling uncontrollably until Olivia sat beside him for hours, reading aloud from her favorite book, as if the words could build a shield against his fear. The day the neighbor's child approached too quickly, hand outstretched, and Shadow backed away with a low growl rumbling in his chest. Not aggression, but the protective instinct of a dog who had learned that the world was not always kind. Each challenge was met with the same steady patience. Olivia never raised her voice, never showed frustration. She accepted Shadow exactly as he was, an old dog with old hurts, learning slowly to trust again. And Shadow began to change. The transformation was subtle at first. A little more alertness in his gaze, a little more strength in his legs. His coat, with proper nutrition and gentle brushing, began to regain some of its luster. The cloudy look in his eyes cleared somewhat, revealing more of the intelligent, watchful soul behind them. Most telling was his behavior when Olivia returned home each day. The first week he had merely lifted his head when she walked through the door, acknowledging her presence with quiet attention. By the second week he was waiting in the front hall, sitting with dignity, but with a new alertness in his posture. By the third, there was a tail wag, still reserved, still careful, but unmistakably a greeting. And then came the evening that changed everything. Olivia had been delayed at work, arriving home later than usual. When she opened the door, calling out a soft apology, she was met not with Shadow's usual careful greeting, but with something extraordinary. He approached her with purpose, his amber eyes locked on hers, and then pressed his entire body against her legs in a gesture of such pure affection that Olivia felt tears spring to her eyes. He wasn't just accepting her presence anymore. He wasn't just accepting her presence anymore. He was seeking it out, choosing it. That night, as they sat together on the couch, Olivia reading, Shadow curled beside her with his head resting on her thigh. She realized that something profound had occurred. This wasn't just about saving an old dog from a sad ending. This was about two souls recognizing something in each other, a shared understanding of what it meant to be overlooked, to be waiting for someone to truly see. Olivia had never told Shadow about the divorce 3 years earlier that had left her feeling invisible in her own right, about the colleagues who looked past her in meetings, the friends who had drifted away when she was no longer part of a couple, the dates who seemed disappointed when they met her, as if expecting someone younger, more vibrant. She had never spoken aloud about how it felt to be the person others glanced at and then dismissed, their eyes already moving on to more promising prospects. She didn't need to tell him. Somehow, he knew. And in his quiet presence, in the amber eyes that now followed her with unwavering attention, she found herself being truly seen in return. 6 months after bringing Shadow home, Olivia took him back to the shelter. Not to return him, never that, but to visit. She had stayed in touch with Rachel, sending updates and photos documenting Shadow's transformation. Now, she wanted to show them in person. When they walked through the door, Shadow's posture stiffened momentarily. The familiar smells, the sounds that had been the backdrop to his forgotten year, they triggered something in him, a ghost of old fear. But then he looked up at Olivia, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to reassure him. His tail, which now wagged freely at home, gave a confident swish. Rachel's jaw dropped when she saw them. "Shadow," she gasped, coming around the front desk. "Is that really you?" The dog standing before her bore little resemblance to the defeated creature that had occupied the last kennel for so long. His coat was healthy now, his frame filled out to a proper weight. He stood tall, confidence in his posture despite the slight stiffness that would always remain in his aging joints. But the most striking change was in his eyes, alert, engaged, full of dignified warmth that had been absent before. As the shelter staff gathered around, exclaiming over the transformation, Shadow accepted their attention with gentle tolerance. But his eyes kept returning to Olivia, checking in, affirming the connection that had become the center of his world. "We wanted to give you these," Olivia said, handing Rachel an envelope. "And we wanted to tell you something important," she continued, her hand resting lightly on Shadow's head. "Every dog here matters, even the ones in the back kennels, especially them." Rachel wiped at her eyes. "We know that. We tried to tell people, but people look for what they think they want, not what they might need," Olivia finished gently. "I came here looking for a companion. I didn't know I was looking for him specifically. I didn't know I needed him just as much as he needed me." Shadow leaned slightly against Olivia's leg, his solid presence a confirmation of her words. As they were leaving, they passed a young couple being shown around the shelter. The volunteer was directing them toward the puppies, but the woman's eyes drifted to an older dog in a middle kennel, a gray-muzzled retriever mixed with gentle eyes. Olivia and Shadow exchanged a glance. Without a word, they changed direction, approaching the couple. "Senior dogs," Olivia said softly, "see into your soul in ways that others can't. They know the value of time. They don't waste a moment of the love you give them." The woman looked at Shadow, then back at the retriever mix. "He's beautiful," she said, her voice thoughtful. Olivia smiled. She corrected gently, reading the kennel card. "Her name is Lady." "And yes, she is." Shadow sat beside Olivia, his posture regal, his amber eyes observing everything with the wisdom of a dog who had journeyed from despair to dignity. In his quiet presence was a testimony more powerful than any words Olivia could have spoken. The couple lingered at Lady's kennel, asking questions about her history, her temperament. And when they finally moved on, it wasn't toward the puppies. It was toward the front desk, with Lady walking gently beside them on a shelter leash. Shadow watched them go, and Olivia could have sworn she saw something like satisfaction in his expressive eyes. Every shelter holds stories waiting to be told, lives paused in kennels, hearts beating behind bars, eyes watching as the world passes by. Some of these stories end with a final quiet whimper, in the back room of a facility that tried its best, but couldn't find that one person, the one who would stop, who would see past the gray muzzle and the cloudy eyes to the soul, still burning bright beneath. But some stories, like Shadow's, find a different ending, or rather, a new beginning. In the year that followed his adoption, Shadow accompanied Olivia to schools and community centers, where she spoke about senior dog adoption. He lay beside her with dignified patience as she told his story, not with pity, never that, but with a celebration of second chances and the wisdom that comes with age. Children would approach him carefully, having been taught how to greet an older dog with respect. Shadow would accept their gentle pats with a regal nod, sometimes offering a paw to shake, sometimes simply leaning slightly into their touch to show his appreciation. Adults would listen to Olivia's words, but it was Shadow who convinced them. This living testament to the transformation that love could create, even in a heart that had forgotten how to hope. The invisible dog from the back kennel had become an ambassador, his very existence a quiet revolution against the notion that worth diminishes with age. And in the quiet evenings, when presentations were done and advocacy work set aside, there was still the simple truth of the two of them, Olivia and Shadow, curled together on the couch, or taking slow walks through the neighborhood as sunset painted the world in gold. These were the moments Shadow seemed to savor most, not the applause after their presentations, not the admiration of strangers who commented on his dignified bearing. Just this, the peaceful companionship of someone who had truly seen him, who had looked past his age and his scars to the faithful heart that had never stopped beating beneath. In the end, what Shadow taught Olivia, what he taught everyone fortunate enough to know his story, was profoundly simple. Love doesn't count the days. It makes the days count. And in a world that too often rushes past the quiet souls waiting in back kennels, this is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest act of love is simply to pause, to look, to see what and who others have overlooked. For every Shadow still waiting, there is an Olivia who hasn't found them yet. Perhaps in sharing this story, that connection moves one step closer to happening. Perhaps someone reading these words will visit their local shelter tomorrow and walk past the puppies, past the bouncing young dogs, all the way to that last kennel in the back. Perhaps they will kneel down, extend their hand with patience, and wait for a hesitant nose to meet their fingertips. And in that simple touch, another invisible heart will finally be seen. Thank you for taking the time to hear Shadow's story. If you've ever had a special connection with a dog, especially a senior dog, please share your experience in the comments below. Every story shared might inspire someone else to consider opening their home to a dog that others have overlooked. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can ensure that no dog remains invisible.